Dearest members of the Buttersock cult, I have a very important announcement to make. From this day forth, I am to be known as Lord Let's Read. First of his name, the legal recounter, the King of Creep. I'm not kidding either. I have an actual lordship now, and all it took was one visit to establishedtitles.com. Established Titles bases their project around an ancient historic Scottish tradition, one which dictates that landowners be referred to as lairds, an archaic Scottish term roughly translated as lord. All it takes to be a lord in Scotland is to own as little as 1 square foot of land, and that's exactly what Established Titles offers. When you purchase a title pack, Established Titles marks out an area of land for you on a private estate near the village of Edelston in Scotland. The land is cordoned off, then properly labeled with your name and newly acquired title. Established Titles then sends you a printable certificate with your very own family crest as proof of your newfound lordship. And you could officially include the title Lord or Lady on your credit card, plane tickets, and even your dating profiles. But Established Titles isn't just a playful novelty because the company is committed to planting at least 1 tree for every single order placed. They're deeply passionate about the protection of woodland areas, and a portion of each order goes to registered charities such as One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future, which means you can buy your way into the aristocracy and save the planet at the same time. However, if you buy a title pack and still feel the crushing existential dread of the peasantry, then Established Titles are totally cool with you turning in your title for a no-nonsense refund. All the more reason to try it out, right? So right now, Established Titles is running a huge Black Friday sale. So if you feel like giving an unusual gift this year, head over to the website and use the code LET'S-READ for an additional 10% off your order. The first 200 of you to purchase a title pack using my link will effectively be right next to my plot, meaning that if enough of you decide to become a lord or lady using the link in the description, we could start our own little Buttersock kingdom. So, to help me establish an autonomous breakaway state in northern Britain, head over to establishedtitles.com/letsread, and let's take our first step toward world Buttersock domination. Since the events of this story only happened several weeks ago, I won't disclose any real names or locations to protect me, my family, and anybody involved within this story. I've recently become a state health inspector, and it didn't take me very long to make enemies, for lack of a better word. My job is exactly how it sounds. I inspect food locations for the state. This includes restaurants, grocery stores, gas stations, and pretty much anywhere that deals with food and sanitation. Being young, I'm often referred to as unknowledgeable or that I'm trying to make a name for myself. But the reality of the matter is that I'm just trying to do my job and keep people from getting sick, or worse. My first time being out in the field by myself didn't go very well, and I fully expected that. My story starts about 40 minutes or so from my hometown, in a small little town surrounded by a beautiful lake. The town has one local independent supermarket that has a great reputation among the locals, and even those throughout the surrounding areas. The store was my next location for inspection. The first half of my inspection went completely fine. Some little asterisks, but nothing that would be detrimental or harmful to the consumers of the store. But after those first few departments came the butcher shop at the store, and believe me when I tell you, I cannot believe nobody has gotten sick from eating from the shop. The tables that the butchers cut on were filthy, and not just with the residue from that day of cutting meat, but the underside of the table had caked on meat that was clearly very old. The walls looked like they had never been cleaned. The knives that were not being used were covered in dried blood and old meat. All the machines used in the department were covered in grime and years' worth of buildup. That alone is enough of a scary story, but unfortunately, my rant of this disgusting department is not where my story ends. As I walked with the manager of this department, I tried to explain to him the issues and why this is a problem. With everything that the world has endured in the last several years, sanitation is obviously incredibly important. This man didn't care at all what I had to say. The butcher was well over 6 foot tall, and I'm not an expert, but I would guess about 6'5", since I'm only about 5'5", and he seemed like he was a foot taller than me. and the man leaned over with his massive frame and billowing loud voice and started to verbally attack me. Now, I have thick skin and a family that knows how to throw around some curse words, but this man just laid into me like I've never heard before. I couldn't even get a word in if I wanted to. In the middle of the man's rants, I turned around and walked out of the department to continue my inspection of the rest of the store, and during this time, I could still hear the butcher from all the way in the back of the store still attacking me with his words. I would be lying if I didn't say that I started to feel like I was going to shed a tear or two when I got into my car that evening. And needless to say, the store had failed the inspection due to the critical condition of the butcher department. When a store fails an inspection, they have a small grace period to correct the issues. After said grace period, I show up to the small store once again, and to my dismay, my butcher friend was there, and as soon as I walked in the door, he just stared at me with a look of disgust. It was intimidating and honestly a little scary the way he stared me down. When I eventually made my way to the butcher shop, I was surprised, and not because they cleaned, but because it was somehow worse, and written in the meat blood on the cutting table was a certain expletive about me. I tried to be stern and tell the butcher that he was not going to pass again, and that this department was a major sanitation risk, and this is where my story gets truly scary. The man went off the deep end again, but this time his eyes were filled with legitimate rage, and his skin turned red. He hollered at the top of his lungs, and I swear if the store manager was not right between us, this butcher would have hit me. As I tried to leave the department like I did on the previous visit to the store, the butcher followed me and kept going on his verbal assault. Nobody could calm this man down, and before things got out of hand even more, I told the store manager that I would have to come back because I didn't feel safe in that store anymore. As I turned and walked away, the butcher said in a menacing and almost maniacal voice, "Goodbye, sweetie." And when I turned around, he was now smiling at me in an extremely creepy fashion, and then he said my name, which really freaked me out, because he either saw it on my name tag, but just the fact that he knew it really gave me the heebie-jeebies. The drive home that night was miserable. It was a long and tiresome day. I still live with my parents as this is my first real job post-college, and I couldn't wait just to sit down, unwind, and get that lunatic out of my head. In the middle of the night sometime, I'm not sure of the exact time, I was awoken by some chatter between my parents in the hallway. I walked out of my room to ask my parents what was going on and why they were awake. My father said that some tall guy was walking around the house, and I immediately asked why he didn't call the authorities, and my father basically just shrugged it off as some wandering fellow walking through the yard. I know that may seem jarring to some people, but in the small town I live in, people walk home late at night from the bars and cut through yards all the time, as we all know each other in the small community. But something about this didn't feel right. The next night it happened again. This time I heard my father calling to the tall man who was just standing in the backyard. The man didn't move or flinch. He just stood there for several moments. When my father asked if the man needed any help, he turned and walked out of the yard, but as he turned, I could see that he was holding something that seemed to shimmer in the light. I don't think I need to remind you what instruments butchers use and what I was thinking in my head right at that moment. I slept with one eye open that night, jumping at every sound I heard outside. It was now Saturday, and I was ready to just stay home and relax. My parents left for some errands, and I ended up taking a quick nap in the living room. When I woke up, I was filled with an overabundance of fear. My front door was wide open in the middle of the day, and a note sat on my kitchen counter that read, "I missed you, but I'll be back tonight." Immediately, and I know I should have did it last night, I just called the cops, who really didn't know what to do at that moment in time, but said that they would keep an extra patrol in that area that night. And my father was clearly more than livid that I called the police without calling him first, and everybody seemed blown away that I didn't wake up to someone breaking inside, leaving a note, and leaving. That night, I clearly didn't sleep a wink, and when I saw the hall light go on from underneath my doorway, I figured my father had woken up again to the noise of the mysterious man. When I opened the door, what I saw at the end of the hallway was not my father, but it was the tall man. the tall man from the backyard, and they were none other than the butcher from the store. He stood about 15 feet away from me at the end of the hallway. I was frozen in fear, and before the man could run at me or do whatever he had intended, a cop was there and tackled the intruder to the ground. My heart was racing. The cop was parked at the end of my street patrolling the area, and he actually saw the tall man walking down the street. He pursued him slowly and saw him walk to my family home and jostle the door until he broke it in. Being that we live in a small town, the cop knew that this man did not live here, and that is when the cop acted fast. The now former butcher was arrested right then, and as far as I know, is still in jail at this moment. I realize when people talk about dangerous jobs, they don't often bring up health inspectors, but in my situation, it truly was life and death. The butcher did in fact have a knife on his person, but he stayed quiet and didn't say what he intended to do to me or my family, and this event has left me mentally wounded and scared to do my job. I basically live off of Instacart and Grubhub now, and I triple-checked that my doors and windows are now locked. Nothing of note has happened yet since the initial arrest, but I'm sure this story isn't over yet. Any updates or new information, and I will share with the world when the time comes, but for the moment, I just want to try and move on from this and be happy that I'm still alive and that my family is safe. The last few years have been tough on everybody, and it's been a strange adjustment for a lot of people. Many jobs have changed on how they operate, and this is both a blessing and a curse. Unfortunately for me, this change was a curse. Something that seemed like it was going to be the greatest news I'd received in a long time ended up being a horrific nightmare that I'm lucky to be able to walk away and tell the tale of. When the world was going through its struggle, I made the choice to go back to school at 30 years old to study video game design. I figured since life was morphing into a more online setting, this would be the perfect chance for me to get back and get my degree. In almost no time at all, I realized how much I loved this program and how much of a knack I had for game design. I fell in love with programming, designing, and all the boring stuff that game design entails, like game documentation. And I got my bachelor's degree in an accelerated program in just a little over 2 years, and then the job hunt started. By this point, the workforce was back in action, but the online workforce was still very strong and growing, as remote work seemed to be more popular than ever. I applied for dozens of jobs, but the competition in this industry is fierce, and I didn't even get a call or email back on any of my applications. And this is until about 3 months or so after my graduation, when I got an email from a game studio called Eye of the Rose Studios. They were a smaller startup company looking for fresh graduates to bring their unique vision to the company. I didn't care that they had no titles launched at this point, and I was kind of attracted to the fact that they were this new company and they wanted me. One of the other things that seemed really sweet about this gig was the fact that I could work remotely until the company was a bit more known. This was the perfect situation for me at the time. I could work from home, on my own, get paid by this company, and make a name for myself all at once, and life was finally looking up for me. I had a professional Zoom interview with a man whose name was Luke Delphine, and Mr. Delphine was blown away by my portfolio, and he seemed fascinated in my ideas and everything I had to say. Now, it's important to note at this point, there were literally no alarm bells going off whatsoever. The man in the Zoom call was clean-cut, wearing a suit, and was sitting in a room where the background was filled with gaming PCs. He seemed knowledgeable about the business and presented himself as a real player within the gaming industry. After the Zoom interview, we chatted casually for a while about our favorite games and gaming mechanics. Part of me thought this may have still been part of the interview, so I kept my professional attitude and demeanor on full display. After the long call, Luke finally said that he would be in touch with all the job information, including payment, start dates, hours, and all that fun stuff very soon, so keep checking my emails. I was over the moon about this job. I got along so well with this Luke guy, and it seemed like someone I would love to work with. I told my parents and my friends about the job, and I couldn't wait to start. But unfortunately, waiting was my life for the next 2 weeks. I was anxious, and after the first week, I sent Luke some messages and never heard back. It was discouraging and frustrating, and I didn't know what to do. And just as I was about to lose hope, I finally got an email from someone who wasn't Luke, but said they worked for Aya the Rose, so I opened the email. The message looked kind of fake, like spam, but I wanted so much for this job and everything to be real, so I read the entire email. It wanted all my personal information, like my address, phone number, bank information for direct deposit, and then just some random questions like, do I live alone? Do I have children or pets? Just questions that didn't seem like they belonged. After I sent the messages back, which I know was a huge mistake, but this working online stuff was all new to me, and I didn't receive an email back until the next day, and the response to the email was just, "Great, thanks." It was not signed by anybody and didn't even have a company name attached. And this is where I finally started to get that pit in my stomach. That, oh God, what did I just do feeling. Another 5 days go by and I hear nothing. I was messaging that email and Luke's email and still heard nothing. And I started to panic and was constantly checking my bank account, but the low dollar amount that was in there was left alone. That night, outside of my apartment, I heard a loud bang. It would have woken me up, but I was already awake gaming on my PC. I heard the bang again and again. I had all the lights off and my room was only illuminated by my computer screen. I left the spare bedroom where my computer is located and made my way to the dark living room, and the loud banging had now turned to the sound of shuffling. I stared at the sliding glass door, which was concealed by the hanging blinds, so I couldn't see what was on the other side. It sounded like there was someone on my balcony. I lived on the second floor, so it wouldn't be impossible for someone to climb up there, but it also wouldn't be easy. I heard the movements of big birds or giant raccoons, but this was bigger, whatever it was. After a brief pause, which felt like an eternity, the sound was now unmistakable. Someone was trying to break into my sliding door, and I was frozen in fear. My phone was in my pocket and all I had to do was call the authorities, but at that moment, all I could think was, I need to hide. I tried to tiptoe away from the door to the hallway, and that's where the second nightmare hit me. There was someone turning my doorknob to my front door as well, not just the sliding door. In the bedroom, there was a bathroom, and I was able to fit inside the small closet inside the bathroom. And finally, logic kicked in, and I remembered my phone in my pocket, and I called the police. I whispered the situation to them, and in my mind, I felt like I was screaming, even though the dispatch operator could barely hear me. Moments after I gave the address, I heard the front door squeak open. I had the operator on the phone the entire time, and I just clenched my phone hoping that the police would show up soon. The footsteps were soft and slow. I could feel his footsteps through the vibrations on the floor as he made his way to the sliding door. The intruder opened the sliding door, and it sounded like more than one person came in through the slider. I could hear some muffled whispers, but couldn't make out what they were saying. The slow footprints continued as the intruders searched the room. They got to the bedroom, and once they realized that I wasn't in there, they turned the light on. I could literally not breathe at this point, and I was terrified that my shaking would give away my location. One of the intruders entered the bathroom and turned the light on. I was crippled in fear at this point. There was no movement for several seconds, and I began to fear the worst. I almost screamed when the intruder drew back the shower curtain. The loud noise of the curtain rod sounded like a blast from a trumpet. The intruder sighed, and then grabbed the doorknob of the small closet I was hiding in, but he didn't open it for some reason. The only reason I can think of is he must have thought that the closet was too small for any adult to fit in, and this was the first time in my life I was happy to be a very below-average size man. As the tension was at an all-time high, I heard a knock at the apartment door. "Police, is everything okay in here?" The intruder that was in the bathroom spoke up calmly and said, "Yes, sir, is there a problem?" And I heard the conversation that transpired next, and I was in disbelief at the calmness of this man. "There was a call about an intruder. Is this your apartment, sir?" The man responded, "Yeah, sorry about that, officer. I really spooked myself out. I thought I heard someone on the balcony, but just a possum. I'm sorry I wasted your time." There was a brief pause, and one of the cops must have thought something wasn't right because he asked if he could look around. The intruder seemed a bit nervous now, but responded with an uneasy okay. As soon as I heard the cop enter the bathroom, I crack open the door and made myself known. The cop motioned for me to go back inside the closet and then quickly went back out into the living room and instantly arrested the man. I came out and told the officer that there were 2 more guys at least, and as I said that, 2 guys burst out of the coat closet and ran out of the door. One of the cops ran after him as the other radioed for backup. After undoubtedly the worst night I'd ever had, it was finally starting to feel a bit safer for a little while anyway. They were able to catch one of the intruders that fled, but the other escaped and his 2 accomplices have yet to turn him in. The main intruder that pretended to be the apartment renter was none other than Luke, and I didn't recognize the other intruder that the cops arrested. This same night, I went home and lived with my parents, and I've never stayed another night in that apartment. I have no idea what these men intended to do to me, attack me, rob me, or worse. One very ironic detail, and one that I found humorous after all this was said and done, was the fact that I typed my account number for my bank account wrong, so they couldn't access my account, and that's why my account remained untouched. I apologize for the long story, but I believe it's important to really do your research when you're applying for a new job, especially online, and never, ever give out your personal information until you know for sure that the job is legitimate. People are sick and twisted, and you never know what kind of evil and atrocities they're capable of until you find out for yourself on the other side. Let me first say that this story happened several years ago and is still to this day the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me. At the time, I didn't really view it as scary, just weird. Years removed from the incident, however, I can reflect just how potentially dangerous and unnerving the situation actually was. Almost 5 years to the date of me writing this, I met Joey. At that time, I had just started with a new company as the head of human resources. After my training, my main duty at this job was to perform all the interviews and do the hiring and placement for most of the new entry-level positions of the company. At first, it seemed like an easy job, and for the most part, it was easy. It was a lot of paperwork and a lot of unpleasant conversation with folks that were horribly unprepared for interviews. The first week of the job, I had performed nearly 50 interviews and nearly nothing of note had occurred. It was not until that Friday of my first week that I had a story to tell my wife at home. A story so strange that I still tell it to this day. As that Friday, I met Joey. The interview started like every other interview. It was friendly and cordial. Joey was a shorter man in his 40s. I didn't remember the exact age, I just remember he was close to my dad's age at the time. His resume was alright, nothing that jumped off the page, but nothing that was awful. He talked for a while about his work history, school history, and his personal interests. Again, nothing that was crazy or noteworthy, just a normal man up to this point. I remember jotting some notes down in my pad that Joey would not be getting a call back, but I wanted to continue the interview just to make sure that I was making the right call. Little did I know, within just a few minutes, I would know for sure that I was making the right call. Just as we were about to wrap up, Joey said, "You know, I have also done other work that isn't on my resume." I sat back in my chair and clicked my pen a couple times. I gave him a nod and told him to continue. He looked down on the ground while he was sitting in his chair and started to twiddle his thumbs, I guess, and much like you would do if you were in trouble in the principal's office in school. His voice got a little rocky and he started to speak through this weird stutter and said, I don't like to put this on my resume because people don't understand, but you look like you would understand me. I can see it in your eyes." This strange sentence freaked me out a little bit, but in a more of creeped out kind of way and not in a real scary way, I suppose. He continued, I used to repossess objects from people, and I really liked it, and I was good at it." Joey piqued my interest, so I fished for some more information. I asked him to elaborate and tell me what company he worked for. No company, I was a business for myself. His tone was now way off, and he was talking slowly and almost with an ominous tone. I asked Joey to elaborate because at this point, I was lost. And the guy said that he would repossess things but didn't work for a repossession company. You know, some people are just ungrateful for the stuff they own. I would take one look at someone and say to myself that there's no way they pay their bills. So I would save everyone the trouble and repossess the car or whatever item may be, not just cars. At this point, this guy showed me everything and more than I needed. It sounded like he was some type of thief, and I just wanted to wash my hands of this nonsense. I looked at Joey and said, thanks for coming in. If we're interested, we'll give you a call, okay? I stood up from my chair and extended my hand for a handshake, and instead of standing and doing the same, he stayed in his chair and started to stare at the pictures on my desk. As I stood there with my hand extended like a statue at this point, he goes on to say, "Is that your wife?" I lowered my hand and now gave the man a bit of a disgruntled look. "Yeah, that's my wife," I said in a dismissive voice, and then I started to tell him he needed to leave, but he cut me off mid-sentence to say, "I bet she doesn't pay her bills. She would be someone I would repossess." In the moment, I didn't even try to dissect what that meant and what delusions this guy was talking about. "Alright, man, you need to leave." I started to get angry and a bit short with him. And then this lunatic goes on to actually lounge in the chair, extending his legs out. This guy was literally not leaving. His voice then changed again and he started to laugh and sounded upbeat. You know, I don't even think I want this job anymore. I think I want to get back into repossession business." I kid you not. After he said this, he pulled out a cigar and started to light the thing right there in my office. I just stood there in shock for a moment and started to shout at him that he needed to leave right now. Joey stood up and stepped right in front of me. I'm not going to lie. I felt a little terrified, but I wasn't going to do anything because that might be my job on the line. My company had security in place, but being that I was so new, I didn't really know the protocol. He grinned, and this was the first time I was able to see his yellow teeth, and he said, "I know your name, and I'll find out where you live, and I hope you pay your bills." He put the cigar out on his suit jacket arm and walked out of the room. I must admit I felt a wave of relief when he left, but I definitely felt freaked out by the entire ordeal. I didn't mention this guy to my supervisors, and I didn't save his resume. In hindsight, I should have reached out to the authorities, or just grabbed him and slugged him. But instead I just chalked it up to this guy being just some sort of freak weirdo. When I went home that evening, my wife was freaked out and told me that I should have done or said something, but I just shrugged it off again. I remember that evening not being able to sleep and noticing a lot of automotive lights in the windows. And the thoughts had crossed my mind. Did this insane man actually find my home? But when I woke up in the morning, thankfully nothing had been repossessed, as he would say. I never heard or saw this man again, but thought about that day for years. To this day, I still have not had an interview quite like that interview I had with Joey. I realize nothing insane or terrifying happened here, but the body language and implications of Joey was so unnerving that it gives me nightmares all these years later. It actually freaks me out more now than it did 5 years ago. I've had coworkers, friends, and family all tell me I'm an idiot for not doing anything or reporting this man, and I realize now that I am. I was young and inexperienced then, and I didn't know what I was doing yet. I hope you enjoyed my weird stories about my interview with Joey. What do you think he was talking about? Was this guy just some thief or just a strange human being? When I was in my late 20s, I had hit a bit of a rough patch. Most of my friends after high school went to college and either moved away or got a job and started to settle down and start a family. Myself, however, I kind of got lost in the shuffle after high school. I did the whole community college thing, but had no direction in life. After I dropped out of college, I worked several mundane jobs just to keep my head afloat. None of these jobs lasted or amounted to anything. One night, things got out of hand and I got into some legal trouble. In the moment, this was the worst night of my life, but it was also the night that gave me the reality check that I needed. After the legal mess was sorted out, I decided it was time to make some changes and make something out of my life. I applied to school and was thrilled to be starting in the fall. In the meantime, I needed a job because my mom was done bailing me out, and I mean that literally and as an expression. Bless that woman, but I needed to become my own man now. My mom is retired now, but when she worked, she was a real estate agent and a very good one too. Through her years in the business, she met hundreds of people, and one of those people was Mr. Alvarez. Now, Mr. Alvarez was 89 years old at the time and was just too old to keep up on the maintenance of his home. He still owned his home and lived in it alone, and this is where I come in. My mom told me that Mr. Alvarez was looking for someone to clean and organize his house because he was too old to do it himself. The reason why my mom thought of me was because she used to clean his home when she was a little younger to make some extra side cash for the holidays or vacations. Unfortunately, my mom's back isn't what it used to be, and she didn't feel as if though she could do it anymore. She asked me because she knew that I was looking for a job, and Mr. Alvarez pays very, very well. A few days after he contacted my mother, she drove me over and I met Mr. Alvarez. He was one of the nicest men I'd ever met in my life. For someone who was 89 years old, he certainly had some pep in his step. He was a peculiar-looking man for sure. He looked a little bit like a hobbit, I suppose, short and somewhat stocky. He had messy silver hair, but still was rocking a full head of it at 89 years old. His most noteworthy feature to me, though, was his massive forearms and hands. This guy almost looked like a cartoon character or something. Old or not, this guy looked like he could crush a coconut with his hands. And needless to say, the meeting went great and we agreed on an arrangement. I would come every Tuesday and Thursday to clean and basically do whatever Mr. Alvarez needed, and he would pay me a staggering $500 per day. That may not be a lot to some people, but for me, that was a literal fortune at the time. Tuesday comes and I get to ride over to the house for my first day on the job. He greets me and it's the same jolly little man I met a few days ago. I work for several hours and clean this mansion of a house and organize a lot of his stuff. Probably an unrelated note here, but this guy had some wild stuff in his house, like full taxidermy animals, crazy antiques, coins that looked ancient, outrageously rare sports memorabilia, and even some stuff from World War II, like uniforms, guns, badges, and an insane number of photos. Mr. Alvarez was one of the most fascinating humans I'd ever met. I left that night and I honestly couldn't wait to go back on Thursday. Thursday comes and the same Mr. Alvarez doesn't greet me at the door. I mean, it was him, but something was wrong. He opened the door and didn't say anything, left it open and walked away, so I walked inside. I closed the door behind me and all the lights were off inside. I walked over to the switch on the wall which controlled the overhead light, and when I flipped it on, he shouted from the other side of the room, "What do you think you're doing?" I froze at that moment because I didn't have an answer. And then I saw the floor in the front room and it was covered in bones. Hundreds of bones, like skeleton bones. I stared in bewilderment because I was at a loss for words. I tried to process this and it was kind of making sense in my head. This guy had a lot of taxidermy around the house and a lot of other random and cool stuff. He probably had some kind of bone collection. "What are all these bones from?" I asked as I was trying to keep my composure. Without hesitation or remorse, he simply responded, "My victims." I felt my heart fall into my stomach. I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't know what to say next, so I just stuttered and began to try and speak. "Mr. Alvarez, I don't really..." He cut me off mid-sentence and said, "Mr. Alvarez." He looked confused, as if he had never heard this name before. "Why did you call me that? My name is Captain." I tried to calmly approach the situation, but I've never dealt with anybody this old. I didn't know if this man was losing his mind or if this was just normal old people behavior. "Okay, Captain, why don't we just sit down and we'll talk?" It seemed like a rational and calm response. I approached the couch and he jumped on me. He started to repeatedly hit me with his cane and he just kept saying, "You'll never find them. You'll never find them." I have to admit that I was right about those forearms. This man was powerful and not a frail old man. I'm a decent-sized guy and I had to actually use all my strength to push this man off of me. And he hit the ground and instantly got back up and started to charge at me while still screaming, "You'll never find them." I was able to run out of the house and run to my mom's house, which was only a few miles. I told her what happened, and she immediately drove over to check on him. We walked inside and Mr. Alvarez was sitting in the living room, and he was his happy and chipper self. Captain was no longer here. We asked if he was okay several times and he just kept saying that he was and was confused at what we were talking about. He says he was sitting on the couch waiting for me to show up and I never came. All the bones were gone too. And when my mom asked about the bones, he laughed and told my mom that she had a wild imagination. After some small talk, we decided this job just wasn't for me and we left. My mom cried a little on the way home because of just how sad the situation really was. Clearly, Mr. Alvarez was starting to slip in his brain and she didn't know if she could call someone or just leave the man alone in his old age. He had no kids and his wife had been dead for almost 50 years, I guess. Only a few days later, he had literally, unfortunately passed away from some type of heart attack or some event like that. It was surreal and almost hard to believe because just days ago he was dancing around like that hobbit I mentioned earlier and attacking me. So the fact that he was dead really hit hard for me. As far as I know, I assume all those bones were related to taxidermy. He did have a will and everything was left to a great niece that we didn't know we ever had. I think about that day all the time, and I wonder to myself, was there anything else related to those bones, and what the hell was that captain persona? And what is it that I might never learn about him or ever find? Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. Anybody who has ever moved to a new town knows how hard it can be to get adjusted to the new everything of life. In my case, I moved from just outside of New York City to a small little town in Nebraska. This change of pace was hard, but it was much needed for me during this point of life. After graduating from college and receiving my dream job in New York City, I thought my life was perfect and heading in an upward trajectory. Unfortunately for me, I could not be more wrong. Not even a year after getting my job, I was fired. The result of this firing is a combination of many things, but at the end of the day, it was my own doing. Struggling and depressed, I decided that I was going to leave the city, and that is how I ended up moving to Nebraska. It's also worth noting that I didn't choose Nebraska out of a hat or anything, but I in fact have an aunt who lives in Nebraska, so it all just made sense for me. I wanted to be in a small town, as far away from the city as I could. My first several weeks in Nebraska were somewhat uneventful. I spent some time with my aunt, learned about the area, and got familiar with where all the stores and everything like that were located. While out and about, I noticed this great little bar right in the center in town. Quick side note, in order to keep myself, my aunt, and the town I lived in safe and quiet, I am refraining from using the name of the town and the name of the bar. Alright, back to the story. This bar is what you may consider a dive bar, but it was bumping when I poked my head in there. Come to find out, this is where all the locals came to drink. Not too far from the town is a massive contracting company, and when the employees leave the job for the day, they all come to this bar to drink. I loved the energy and everything about this bar. All the locals who were drinking in this bar were friendly and really nice. I introduced myself right away to the bartender who, oddly enough, was the owner of the establishment. She was an older woman. Rugged and tough are the two descriptors I would use to describe this woman. A room full of men, and this woman took no nonsense from anybody in there, but in return, all the patrons of the bar seemed to treat her with a massive amount of respect. After chatting with her for a little while, I brought up the fact that I bartended in the city when I was in college, and without hesitation, she asked me if I wanted a job as a bartender. I was flattered, and of course I accepted. I needed a job, and with all the customers drinking in this bar on a Wednesday night, I figured that I could do quite well with my tips. I started that Monday, and within no time at all, I was being treated as a local. I learned most of the regulars' names and their drinks fairly quickly, but anybody who has been a bartender or any kind of server really knows that it's not all sunshine all the time. You will, without a doubt, get unwanted attention and just horrible or rude customers. But this one specific customer was neither horrible nor rude. Actually, he was quite charming and handsome. He didn't look like any of the other men in this town, and that's not an insult on Nebraska, it's just that this town was really small and kind of poor. He didn't see a very many men who looked like this guy, and he said his name was Peter, and that he was in finances for this job. Giving me a little job title so broad should have been a red flag, but his beautiful smile was more important to me at the time. He was tall and muscular, very tan, and had jet black hair, a little bit of scruff, and he was wearing a suit. Did I mention how beautiful his smile was? I know I'm overhyping this guy a little bit, but I swear he looked like a movie star. So this handsome man came in 2 nights in a row and stayed at the bar and talked to me most of the time. Before he left that second night, he asked if I would be interested in grabbing a late bite to eat tomorrow evening. I'm not sure if I was lonely or just that hypnotized, but I accepted right away. When he left the bar that night, I spoke with the owner of the bar for a few minutes, and this is where I should have noticed 2 glaring red flags that I blatantly ignored in the moment. She told me in that grisly smoker's voice of hers, "I don't like that man, honey. Just please be careful." She literally liked everyone, so for her to not have a good feeling about this man should have made me run for the hills, but I didn't even pay any attention to her words. The second alarm bell I chose to ignore was how the customers of the bar were looking at and treating this man. As I stated previously, these guys were super nice, and to this man they were as cold as ice. Looking back in hindsight, most of the men there just stared at this guy with a strong look of worry. Maybe at the moment I took it as some kind of jealousy or something, but realistically, I didn't notice any of the looks or attitudes. The night came and the handsome man picked me up from the bar at 11 p.m. in a massive blue Chevy Silverado. I was kind of excited to hit up one of the late-night diners or something along those lines, but instead, he took me to a house about 10 minutes away from the bar. Believe it or not, I was a bit apprehensive getting out of the car, but he charmed me inside in no time at all. The house was strange and very dark. All the lights were dim and gave off a very low hue. It smelled bad, but wasn't unbearable, and I finally started to feel a little uneasy after being blind for so long. When I finally started to think, I started to freak out that I didn't have my car and that he was already drinking pretty heavily. How was I going to get home? I was reminded of that feeling I felt when we arrived at the house and that I wasn't ready for a house call just yet. He was certainly charming and handsome, but I also didn't know him at all. The worst part about this, though, was when he actually started to cook. That bad smell was now horrible. He kept raving about this delicious meat that he had hunted, but he couldn't tell me what it was because it was a surprise, and I probably wouldn't eat it if I knew what it was. Those were his words. As he cooked, the smell was making me dizzy, and I could barely focus on anything other than breathing. He was talking to me from the kitchen as I sat on the living room couch. Other than the dark interior, the actual house was not that bad. It was a wide open living room, and he had a lot of books lying around everywhere. I eventually approached the kitchen to tell him that I was going to sit outside and get some fresh air. But as I approached the doorway to the kitchen, he stepped right in front of the door and stood over me. "What do you want? I told you not to go into the kitchen." I froze only for a second, mainly due to the intimidating nature of this confrontation. I was able to spit out the words, "I'm just going to sit outside for a minute, get some air." He smiled and responded, "Oh, yeah. I know the smell can be bad, but once it's cooked, you're going to be in paradise. Go get some air, and I'll come outside in a minute. I'm just cleaning up my mess." I sat on the front steps and contemplated what I should do. Should I just suck it up and eat the food and ask him to take me home? He has been super nice to me, and I have no reason to believe he wouldn't if I asked. Should I just run and cut my losses and say no way to this whole ordeal? This guy is just too weird for me? Should I go inside and just be blunt as to what we're eating? These were all thoughts that crossed my mind, but before I could act on any of them, he opened the door and sat next to me. He then proceeded to carry on with one of the weirdest little rants I'd ever heard with my own ears. He said, "I really hope you like this dish. I can't get this meat all the time. It's hard to get this meat. Actually, it's illegal to get this meat. You have no idea how hard it was for me to get it. I want to go hunt some more, but I know it's probably not a good idea." The look in his eyes at this point was terrifying, and the man from the bar who got me to come to his residence was not the same man anymore. Thinking quickly on my feet, I asked him to give me just 1 minute alone. I told him I had to call my sister for something private, and I used the phrase, "women's stuff." I don't even have a sister, so I don't know why this was the first excuse that came to my mind. In a split second, the eyes sparkled again and he said, "Of course," as he flashed that big smile. As soon as he shut the door behind him, I turned and ran as fast as I could. I realized that I was far away, but not far enough that I didn't recognize some of the area on the way to his house. Once I got about 100 yards away, I dipped into the tree line of the main road so I couldn't be seen in case he had chased me. To my absolute horror, no sooner than I jumped into the trees, I saw that Chevy Silverado drive by. I called the owner of the bar, and she came and picked me up at a gas station about another mile up the road. I just told her that she was right, that there was something off about him. I didn't go into any details and she didn't ask. I never saw the man after that night, and it wasn't until a few weeks later that I finally told my story to a few of the customers and my boss. They were outraged and horrified. I described the smell of the meat to them, and a few of them turned as white as a ghost. They told me that I didn't want to know what kind of meat that was, and that I needed to give them the address right away. They came back the next night and told me that the house that I had given them had been abandoned. There was nothing inside when they looked through the windows, no truck, and certainly no man. I have absolutely no idea what this man intended on having me eat. I have no idea where his intentions lied that evening, and I have no idea where this man went. Please, anybody out there who meets someone new, always have a plan and know where you're going, and tell someone where you are. I'm so lucky that my boss of my new job of only several weeks cared enough about me to come out late at night to pick me up from potential harm. My life has finally calmed down a little bit, and I'm happy to report that there have been no more dinner dates with what I can only assume was a cannibal. After years of college, I finally scored the first step on my dream job journey. I was at the bottom of the totem pole at a government facility, but I was in the door, and that was a step in the right direction. Unfortunately, due to the nature of this job, I must be somewhat vague about exactly what I did. Don't worry though, it's nothing super exciting like aliens or anything, just sensitive information that I can't make public, even if I am writing this anonymously. The people of this office were, well, let's just say, wound tight. Not mean or rude, but certainly not nice. And that was until I met Sue, or Susie as she liked to be called, because according to her, Sue is an old person name. Her words, not mine. I really vibed with Susie. She was smart, funny, showed me some stuff at the job, and I was kind of into her. Everybody at this new job of mine was cold, but Susie was on fire all the time. Her lively and bubbly personality was contagious, at least for me. The first few weeks of this job were amazing, and I hate to say it, but it was solely because of her. I forgot about my focus and my yearning to grind to the top because all I cared about was going to work to see Susie. I admit this was a pretty toxic mindset on my part, but I'm only human, and at least I can admit this fault. My only regret is that I couldn't see between the lines back then. Several weeks into this job, I finally worked up the courage to actually ask Susie out. And to my surprise, she actually said yes. It was a great evening from start to finish, and if I wasn't head over heels into Susie by this point, I definitely was after our date. Fast forward to the following weekend, and Susie asked if I wanted to do something again, and Of course, I agreed with no need to talk me into the plan. She said that she was going to pick me up, which I found kind of weird, but I'm not big into gender norms, so if she wanted to drive, go right ahead, I thought. When she arrived to pick me up, she was in the back seat and some other guy was driving. I was not a huge fan of this development, but I was blinded by the supernova that was Susie. As I approached the car, it dawned on me that I never asked her what we were going to do that evening, and it was the first time I felt any type of way besides love for Susie. Maybe it was weird jealousy or something, but honestly, it wasn't enough of a flag for me to run away, yet. I got into the car, and the guy driving said nothing. Susie greeted me with a huge hug and asked if I was excited about an amazing evening. I smiled, of course. I was like, heck yeah, but was still a little freaked out that nobody has acknowledged the guy in the car yet. Finally, I introduced myself to the driver, who just gave me a "what up" nod, but audibly said nothing out loud. As I stared with a bit of confusion, Susie spoke up and said, "Oh, that's Sebastian. He doesn't say much. He's just an old friend who agreed to drive us around tonight." Now, don't get me wrong. I know how weird this sounds, and writing it now I keep smacking myself in the face, but in the moment, I just shrugged it off and went along with the ride because of Susie. Before long, I knew where we were, and I was definitely a bit sketched out now. Not to mention the entire ride, Sebastian kept looking at me in the rearview mirror, which I didn't enjoy. Behind the giant building I work at is a heavily forested area, and this man parked the car and shut it off in the forested location behind my work. This was the moment I finally spoke up and said, "Susie, what are we doing here? We can get it." And she cut me off before I could finish my sentence. "Listen, I need you. Sebastian's not an old friend. He's one of the security guards, and he told me that the camera in the back is faulty, and he gave me the code to get in through the back door." I couldn't tell if she was serious or if this was a funny joke to play on the new guy. I looked her in the eyes and said, "Susie, I'm not comfortable with this. What could you possibly need in this building at this hour?" Susie looked down and then back at Sebastian and then back at me. "Please," she said with those eyes that I was a sucker for. I shook my head, knowing all too well that this was not going to end well for me, but I got out of the car anyway. We made our way to the door, and the camera above the back door did look a little crooked but looked operational, and she entered the code and it worked. I couldn't believe it. Once inside the building is where my heart stopped, and I truly grasped the gravity of what we were doing. We're not talking about a slap on the wrist, but legitimate trouble if we got caught breaking into a government facility. We traveled through several corridors and tight hallways and made our way to parts of the building I have never seen. At the end of a long, dark hall was a room filled with all sorts of files and papers that quite honestly looked like nonsense to me. She briskly ran to the back corner of the room and started rummaging through a file cabinet, and she knew exactly what she was looking for. "I got it," she exclaimed, and she turned to me and said, "Okay, this is where I need you." She got close to me, as if she were going to kiss me, but instead struck me on the head with something. I don't even remember what it was, it happened so fast. I saw her running away as my vision blurred, trying to stand up. I tried to make my way through the halls, remembering just how we got there, and now I was thinking that Susie purposely took me on a confused route so I wouldn't remember my way out. And using only a cell phone flashlight, I finally could see the back door in the distance, and my night was just getting worse at this point, because about 10 feet away from the door, I saw that the alarm started to go off. And this is why Susie needed me. She needed someone to take the fall for her theft, and I figured my time was up, but I kept going anyways. I made it out the door and into the woods before any security were able to get there, but of course, Sebastian and Susie were gone. I traveled in the shadows until I got home that evening, and I sat up and waited for the cops or Susie to show up all night and all weekend, but nobody ever came. On Monday morning, I got to work and I instantly noticed two things. There was an outrageous amount of security there, and Susie was not there. I thought about this all weekend, and I figured my best course of action would be to come clean, so I went into the main office and sat with my supervisor and just told her everything. And it turns out the cameras weren't faulty at all, as they had clear video of us entering the building. There were also dozens of cameras that picked us up in the building, and I explained to them why I was there, and I tried to justify it, even though there really was no justifying it. Without getting into a lot of legal babble, I pretty much was free to go if I would cooperate with the investigation of Sebastian and Susie, among a few other things. And first off, Sebastian did not work for the company, and most likely was not his real name. He was some sort of computer hacker or something along those lines, and that is how he was able to get the backdoor code. Susie, on the other hand, that was her real name, and they had all her personal information, and she was a legitimate government employee. Where she lost her way is what everyone is trying to figure out. After the incident, she essentially went AWOL, and to this day, as far as I know, nobody's heard from her. They asked me a million times what file she took and why she took it, and I only caught a quick glimpse of it, and all I could see was the words project on it. And I've tried wrestling my mind around what it could be, but I have no idea. But it seems that my supervisors get super uneasy when I talk about it. I've gone crazy trying to dissect everything Susie has ever said to me. Did she ever give me any inclination that she was like this, or what she may have wanted? I was blinded by fake love, and I can't tell to the best of my knowledge if she hinted at some sort of greater plan, and I clearly lost that job, and I'm under a pretty short leash these days. I'm kind of writing this in hopes that maybe somebody's heard or seen this Susie character. She's a blonde woman with bright green eyes, maybe 5'4", very intelligent and very quick-witted and funny. Anybody out there know anything related to this project, even though I know how vague that sounds? It's been about 10 years since this incident, and I'm still thinking about it today. I know this story seems a little far-fetched and out there, and I wish I could give more details, but unfortunately this is all I can recall from the event and all I'm able to disclose about this incident. In late 2019, I was on the hunt for a new job. I am what you call a jack of all trades. I've never had an issue finding a job or making money. My issues come from the fact that most of my jobs don't really last. I'm the person people call when they need something fixed, whether that be something electrical, plumbing, painting, even cars. I never worked for a specific company and just got most of my work through word of mouth. One night at the bar, I ended up meeting a nice guy named Jonathan. We got talking about maintenance and contracting work, and I could see his eyes light up. "Hey, if you're looking for a job, you could come down in the condo complex down the road." I smiled, but didn't really know how to respond. I didn't know what working for a condo meant. "I'm the head of all the maintenance and tech at the condos. I got a small crew, and I could use someone like your talents." I shrugged and said, "Okay." That's the type of guy I've always been. I don't really think things through enough. I don't really take my time with it. I make rash decisions like I made that night, which would end up being a massive mistake. The next afternoon, I showed up at the condo and met Jonathan. He introduced me to his crew and basically gave me a tour of the complex. The place was beautiful. I didn't think condos could look that nice, but then again, I really didn't know what a condo even looked like on the inside. This complex had its own 24-hour gym, a game room, a theater, a sports complex, a spa, and a massive garage to keep your vehicle safe. This place was really cool. Jonathan then took me to the basement, which is where our offices were located. The basement was the first part of this entire complex that didn't look amazing, and it looked like a regular dark and depressing basement. Once down there, we walked by a massive steel door that was slightly ajar, and I stole a quick glance, and I swear it looked like a dead animal in there, but we were walking so fast I didn't really have a chance to be sure. Once Jonathan stopped talking, I asked him, "Hey man, what's in that metal door over there?" And his expression changed instantly. "Oh, that door, it's not supposed to be open. It's the owner's storage room. I'll just go close it quick." He ran over quickly and used his entire side of his body to push the door shut, and then checked it to make sure it was locked after shutting. He then walked back over, smiling, and said, "That was weird, better just ignore that room. I nodded, but was not feeling super okay about this. After the weird door incident, Jonathan gave me a task list to accomplish, and I did everything on the list. When I left that day, he gave me my keys, which granted me access to the building in case I was called after hours from some maintenance emergency. Anybody who knows me knows that when I get my mind fixated on something, I need to have an answer. I went home that night and I couldn't stop thinking about that room. Around 1 a.m., I got out of bed and decided to drive to the condos. I have a key now, so I can get in and not worry about breaking in or doing anything illegal. And the first thing I noticed when I pulled into the lot was that Jonathan's car was there. I know it was his car because he carried on at the bar about how great his yellow Jeep Wrangler with the black rims is, and I know he doesn't live in the complex and he was there before me today, so I know he still wasn't working. Something felt weird and I instantly felt uncomfortable. I started to try and rationalize it and came up with two very plausible solutions. He could have been on a late call, which I figured was not likely because he told me he usually sends one of his crew, or two maybe he was seeing someone who lives there. He works there, so it's possible that he is dating someone there as well. I walked into the main lobby and used my key to open the basement door. I started to make my way into the basement and I heard laughing. Uncontrollable laughter, and not just from one person. I paused on the stairs and tried to listen to what this commotion was, and it was hard to hear, so I kept trying to creep my way closer to the noise. When I got to the base of the stairs, I could see the glow of the candlelight reflecting off the walls and floors, and now I could clearly make out Jonathan's voice, and he wasn't saying anything specifically, just laughing and screaming nonsense noises. I turned the corner and saw that the metal door was now wide open and a bright glow of candlelight shined out from the door. There was definitely an animal carcass of some kind. I think a deer lying on the floor of this room. I then saw Jonathan and three of his crew dancing around this animal like children on Christmas morning. I stood watching like a deer in the headlights, pardon the pun, until Jonathan noticed me. He stopped and that expression on his face changed again. When he stopped, his crew stopped as well and all four men stood there staring at me. It was the tensest few seconds of my life, and we all just stood still and stared and nobody said anything. Finally, Jonathan just screamed at the top of his lungs, like a drawn-out cackle of some kind. The other three men started right after Jonathan. I started to back up because I finally realized what was happening and I wanted out. As I backed up, all four men charged at me, and I turned and ran. They didn't chase me outside of the basement, at least not that I could tell. I called the condo management the next day to report what I saw, and I was shocked by the conversation we had. Not that I was going to ever go back there, but the manager fired me and said that I had broken in. He told me that Jonathan had the basement on surveillance and he had caught me trying to do some kind of animal ritual. I tried to argue my case and claimed that it was Jonathan and not me, but the management team instantly took his side. He said that I'm lucky that he won't press charges, and if I wanted to stay that way, I should stay away permanently. I said fine by me and hung up the phone. And for years I've been wondering about several things. I've always wondered if I should have tried to reach out to authorities myself. Maybe I could have got somewhere. At the time I was broke and scared that this would cost me a lot of legal fees, and I didn't have those. And if these people were financially powerful, I would have ruined my life. I also wonder often what the heck was going on down there. I know nothing about that kind of stuff. I'm good at fixing things, but not very good at knowing whatever that was. Does anybody out there have any idea what that was? And was it harmless? In the moment it was horrifying, but was I truly in real danger? Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, meat's back on the menu, boys.